Welcome to the 2 Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take a single book, break it down bit by bit, section by section, talk about it, analyze it, have fun, make jokes. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, joined as always by Brian Wood, author of Joytime Killbox.
Hi, Chad. I'm super depressed. I got a really bad review in The Guardian today, and I just don't know what to do with myself.
Oh, no.
Throwing shade.
No, nobody reviewed my book. So I thought I'd want to review, but actually reading some bad reviews, I don't want anybody to ever review. Exactly. No news.
Very true. And we're joined by special guest Robin Myers, who translated Cars on Fire and has translated other things, is also a poet. And thank you for joining us from Mexico City. Thank
you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad this was a great little 3-episode run, since we got to have everyone that's on here was great. And it was great to talk to Monica.
Yeah, that was great. I so enjoyed listening to both of the other sections, and with Christina also. That was wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you're Brian, you're going to ask this, but I'll ask for you. So how did you end up, how did you first come to Monica's work?
It was all because of actually a sort of seminar that Monica organized before I knew her. I've lived in Mexico City for a number of years. I can't remember where I saw the mention of a sort of call for submissions to this event, which is called A-Fest. And it was organized by Monica and by Heather Cleary as well, who I know is a translator for you guys too. And it was a feminist translator gathering. And so the idea was that sort of young women translators could submit work and be paired with a sort of a more established translator. And then there was going to be a gathering in New York City to work on the texts that had emerged from these collaborations. And the texts that were up for selection were by poets and writers who were also going to participate in this multi-day event. So I remember getting a sort of packet of material from all, and there was both poetry and fiction. And I was completely floored by the story that was Monica had work represented as well. And it was a section of the story Cars on Fire, the title story of this book. And I was thinking, what is this? And who is this? And it was just so wild and electric and alive. And I was so excited reading the story. And I ended up, we had to sort of put in some some sort of your first choice, your second choice. And Monica, I remember, was my first choice. And so I spent, I guess it was a couple of months working on the draft of this segment of her story. And then I went to New York and was part of this one-day event, which was so cool. It was just a really lovely, warm, exciting event. I met lots of people there who I'm now in touch with or have remained in touch with. But it was really through sort of seeing this random call for submissions that I ended up going to this thing and discovering Monica's work. And we ended up just continuing that collaboration. It was just that one day, but it turned into, I really wanted to keep translating the book. She told me that she was working on this collection of short stories that hadn't been published in Spanish yet. And we decided to just sort of take it from there and see what happened. And this happened.
Yeah. And then I couldn't remember, we mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but I can't remember which stories you sent us initially.
It was, I can't remember either.
Dead Men Don't Rape was in there.
I think so, yeah. I think it would have been Dead Men Don't Rape, at least part, if not all, of Cars on Fire. Yeah. And I think there was one more. It was so long ago, I can't remember.
Maybe?
I'm sorry?
It could have been maybe the student or the writer. I think it was
maybe part of the writer. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I should have. Yeah,
I don't know either. And I was like, oh, this is really wild, and yeah. And then and it was great because we had met. Holy shit! 2009.
2009, Chad. Yeah.
2009. I was
in college.
At Whittemore. Am I remembering that? Wow. Okay. That's
you remember that. I'm going.
Something I remember because didn't you work with Sybil and Forrester there
Yeah, she actually wasn't my professor, but I knew of her, and I had friends who had taken translation workshops with her, and she encouraged me to apply to ALTA as a fellow. And I did. And so I was there. That's actually the only time I've physically gone to ALTA so far. But yeah, it was my senior spring, I think, or fall or whatever. Baby translator.
Yeah, I remember you're sort of in more that it was in Pasadena. It was and that ALTA is like amazing to think back to. So like not only did we go to Liquid Kitty, if you remember.
This bar, I have like very vague memories of that bar, but yeah, Liquid Kitty. There was this guy who had a sports car that he had rented, and he was who was that?
Oh my God, it was Reiner's right-hand man at Texas. My God, I can't think of his name. But yeah, we went to Liquid Kitty. We put like black and white porn on the wall.
Yeah, and like very high ceilings, extremely high. Yeah.
Yes.
All artfully done.
Very artful. Yeah.
super hipster, a lot like Los Angeles. And then there's two other things that are funny. That was the one where the membership meeting exploded, and the new president was announced, and then they tried to fire her immediately and get her deposed the same within 1 hour. And it was like a fight, and people were yelling. And someone's like, "Why would we ever go to Kansas City? There's nothing in Kansas City except for barbecue."
No, they have there's fountains.
Fountains?
Yeah.
I think I didn't. I remember. I think it was actually probably you who told me that had happened, and I didn't know because there was an unfortunate, like the fellowship reading was scheduled at the exact same time. So all of us were just, "What's going on here?" We were all very confused.
It was nuts. And then in the book, the 3% Problem that I have, like the ebook, you and I went and did all those interviews with people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like a whole chunk of that book for the and on the website, where he interviewed all the translators we could with like what their favorite word was, books that they wanted
really cool.
to translate. I can't remember all the questions, but yeah, that was super fun.
It was really nice.
Now that we've digressed down memory lane, I feel like
back in the day. Yeah.
So I have a question
Yeah.
that might be more for some of the listeners of the podcast, but there's a lot of folks that are currently working on translations or trying to get translations published. What was your publishing journey like becoming a translator? How did you get into this weird niche of publishing?
It is weird.
I'm always curious how you break into it.
Yeah.
There's so many different paths.
Well, for me, I think, the initial sort of fascination was that it was sort of the convergence of two things. One was that since I was quite young, I've been obsessed with poetry. I've written poetry and read a lot of poetry. And then I've had for a long time, really starting from childhood, like this very, very strong pull to Mexico particularly. And I knew, that if I was sort of going to be able at some point to spend more time in Mexico, and I really, even as sort of a child/teenager, just sort of had this sense that was where I wanted to be. I had to learn Spanish, and I wanted to learn a lot about literature in Spanish. So initially I started by translating poetry, but it was very much in this sort of really kind of innocent longing, like to combine these two things. Like, these are the two things I love most. I want to figure out sort of how they can talk to each other.
Okay.
And I had started, it was in college that I started translating. I had been, I left college for a little while. I was in Mexico for about half a year, and then I ended up studying in Argentina, and I took a translation workshop, a poetry specifically translation workshop, which I really loved. And then, sort of long parenthesis in there, but when I ended up moving to Mexico, which was in 2011, it was really just one of those things I don't know, like I was 22 years old or something, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I had a couple of friends, and I needed to make some money. And so I ended up deciding, like, well, I know Spanish, and I've translated some poems, and maybe I can it was my first sort of experience of talking up kind of my own basically null work experience. But I ended up, through acts of generosity from loose acquaintances, starting to translate in Mexico, mostly for Mexican institutions or people who needed to have bilingual materials of some sort. At the beginning, it was a lot of museums. I still translate for museums sometimes. And then increasingly Mexican academics who live or work in the States and have to be publishing in English and who maybe work with literature or poetry. So there actually were sort of unexpectedly these bridges that I didn't really think, I don't know. There was also a lot of initially sort of translating like manuals, and stuff I was sort of wildly untrained for, some medical stuff that I had no background. It was terrifying to me. And I think, yeah. But gradually, I think it was always clear to me that what I really wanted to be doing was as much literary translation as possible. That's the dream, is to do all that, if that's your jam. And that has been difficult. And I think it's difficult just because it's, it's a hard market and there isn't very much money in it. And there are lots and lots of people translating from Spanish specifically into English. But I think I also really felt acutely that, I hadn't gone to graduate school. I didn't have an MFA. I had never worked in publishing. I really didn't know how to go about it. I still feel like that some of the time. And I just sort of started translating as much as I could and sending stuff out to magazines as much as I could and trying for a really wide range of both poets and prose writers. And I've had some interesting conversations about translator friends about these different approaches. I know that there's sort of the tack of, kind of finding this one book that you devote yourself to, and you do as much as you possibly can to get that one book out into the world. That's sort of like the initial launch experience. And my tactic has been more of just sort of shooting wherever I could, just sort of trying to have, just trying to hustle a lot. And it still feels very erratic and confusing, and it's just such a volatile industry in so many ways. But it has also been really exciting, just to sort of translation. I think for me, the more I think about it, is sort of represents in some way just like my relationship to academia in a sense, and that I've always been this huge nerd, and I like writing and reading, and those are sort of the only two things I really like, but I've never really wanted to be a specialist in anything, and so translation is just a sort of one apprenticeship after another, in a way I find profoundly gratifying, and I have found gratifying even when I really haven't had a clear sense, to be honest, of where it was all going.
Yeah, man, that's really interesting. Did you help with the when Mexico was the guest of honor at the Book Expo too, right? Yeah,
that was a brief stint it was the government, so basically what's now with the Ministry of Culture, and I had a sort of, was offered this, long story, but yeah, just sort of this job that I thought would be like a good idea, to have like a sensible job for a while, 2 months. Never again.
Perfect.
But yeah, that's the next time I saw you, Chad, was in New York at Book Expo America. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember because you introduced me to a few different publishers that were like new hip publishers that were starting out. Like I can't think of the name of, but that publishes your poetry.
Antílope?
Yes.
I guess they were maybe just getting their start then. But then there's another press which was definitely there, called Almadía.
Oh yeah.
Which I think they were in the same panel that you were on in Sexto Piso also.
Sexto Piso was in there for sure.
Yeah, who are sort of two of the big names in independent literary publishing in Mexico. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Monica's book, what was the most difficult thing? I'm curious as what was the most difficult thing for you to translate it, but I'm also curious how much your translation of poetry played a role in translating her stories, since they aren't completely like conventional, linear, neo-realistic stories.
Yeah, well, it's a very challenging book in lots of ways, and I felt really challenged by it in a way that I always found exciting and sometimes intimidating, especially at the beginning. And I think a lot of it is that, and I know that Monica spoke some about this last week, is there is this constant play with. There's a sort of strangeness that's built into what's already happening, that it's not a sort of like magical realism sort of development of this. Yeah, it's not a sort of symbolic gesture, not that magical realism has to be just that, but it's not what we think of, I think, in in the sort of Garcia Marquez vein, you know, which is sort of it in the way that like sort of strangeness in Latin American fiction is often talked about. She's already working with scenes that are themselves changed and transformed and continue to transform. And I think, and they can be sometimes arresting in the sense of, wait, am I supposed to know what's going on? Am I supposed to know if this character is a cat or if it's a woman? Or, and so I think there was, as a translator, there was a certain amount of anxiety I felt initially, which was assuaged in getting and having a really close working relationship with her and talking a lot of these decisions through about sort of how to respect the ambiguity of the text and how to not over-determine the reading and how to guide the reader to some extent in a sort of, you know, to have there be a sort of solidarity with the reader, but not a hand-holding, which I think is very different. And so how to sort of protect the weirdness, which is where a lot of the sort of blossoming happens. I mean, I think of Monica's work as sort of full of generative stuff that's happening all the time. And I think and that takes a political turn too. I mean, I think there's this sense sometimes of, you know, she said last week about even in what's going on, say, in the States right now, the sense of these huge protests and what some people are sort of calling these riots are. And she said, you know, can't you see that this is also a celebration, you know, that this is a sort of life-giving collective experience. And I think it just sort of, I started to realize as I started to translate her work that happens all the time in her work, you know, that there's these sort of outbursts that become transformations and they become sort of expressions for the possibility of change. So I thought a lot about that. And then, you know, just in the sense on a kind of language basis, I'm thinking about a story like that's the second to last story called The Root, where there's just really intense interplay with pronouns, and there's a sort of a collective we, but there's a group of she's, but there's this one woman, and then there's and so I think for me in writing poetry and translating poetry, where for me the sort of the point of poetry is that it teaches you how to read it. Like a good poem will sort of show you on a kind of tactile level, like what it's made of and how it's trying to use its own elements. And so I think of Monica's work or that story as an example, as a sort of poem in that sense that it's like, okay, you know, here is this wild range of subjectivities and of appearances and of identities that are going to be changing all the time. And so how to make that as beautiful as she does in Spanish, and how to make it to show that it's being ambiguous without sort of shoving, you know, it just sort of let you take part in the wonderment of that ambiguity. And I do think poetry has a lot to do, like that's the business, you know, of poetry in a way.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, that story is the most wild, I think.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, I love that.
Like, oh, I don't know how you did this. It starts out with the line, they said there weren't 12 of me when that woman gave birth to us, our arms and our chests and our legs coated in, I can't say that word, Lanugo?
Lanugo, uh-huh.
Lanugo is right? Okay. Mm-hmm. I gotta look up how to say that because I want to screw it up. But yeah, and then like the next page has like a line that I marked up. A lone man came down to the path in a horse-drawn cart. He got out when he saw my 12 bare legs entwined. He wanted to touch them, but he didn't know which. He realized we were having sensual dreams about him, and he fled toward the dawn edifice that grew like fungi, drying out everything around it. I'm like, okay.
Whoa.
I don't know what is happening necessarily. And, you know, the instructions for an eye is pretty wild.
Yeah.
That's like got the hour as for most of for the whole thing, our voices and all that. Did you, so I noticed in that one, it references the Edouard Levé book, and then we have the different quotes in the back of like where everything came from. Mm-hmm. Did you pick up on all of those as you were translating it, or did she?
Certainly not. Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of those things, to be honest, that sometimes I think like, oh, am I being is this bad? You know, that I wasn't sort of tracking every intertextual reference all the time. And that, you know, there's a sort of the neurotic, I mean, some of it I do think like we always benefit when we translate to knowing as much as we can about the process that the writer went through. But I think in lots of cases, I mean, you know, Monica herself said last week that sometimes she forgets, you know, that there's such a mesh of different voices and sources. And that's part of the point also, you know, is that it makes me think a lot about this another writer that I've been translating recently, who was also part of this festival where I met Monica, named Cristina Rivera Garza, and she talks a lot about the sort of dissolution of the author, not just in the sense of like the death of the author, but in the sense that, you know, these sort of, that we are all collaborative. If we write anything, we are collaborating. And I think Monica has a lot of that in her own work, is this sense of sort of like already there are going to be lots of voices who are part of it. And some of them are much sort of more obvious references. And I think of, like, you guys talked last week about invocation, where she mentions Coyontai, and, you know, it's like an explicit reference in the book. So there's a lot of that too, in Freud and Lacan, and but a lot of times it's just sort of there, you know, part of it.
Brian, you should ask questions because Alex is being really loud.
Sure. I know you mentioned it briefly, but is there a big difference for you in translating poetry versus translating a short story? Because I'm primarily a short story writer, and I liken a short story writer maybe more akin to a poet than, say, like a novelist or a long prose writer, where there's the economy, and there's a lot of, it's almost the elegance comes in taking things out, and then the weight and the exactness you can get on the diction, on the level of diction and the word choice. Did you find that some of that, you know, cutting your teeth with poetry, for instance, helped with translating short fiction, or am I in the wrong direction?
No, I think definitely. I mean, I think a lot of just what you said, which I think can happen in a novel too, in the sense that, you know, diction, the sort of weight of particular words or particular sentences or pieces of dialogue over others, it changes so much. Hello. But I also think that with something like a short story, there's, I think for me, the most comparable thing maybe is that you know that you're working with a sort of unit of text on some level, like it's a thing that is sort of presenting itself to you as intentionally more brief than it could have been, you know? And I do think as a poet and a translator of poetry, a lot about form, not in the sense of everything being a type of poem, a sonnet or whatever, but just in the sense that poetry is so deliberate about what sort of physical form it takes. And I sort of want to treat all writing like that. I mean, I think that for me is just sort of a standard, but I think something like short fiction, I mean, even in these stories of Monica's, like they are so different in their scale, you know, that there's some of them that are so sweeping, in their sense of time and in their sense of place, and others that are incredibly concentrated. I think of a story like The Extermination, which is these really long sentences, these huge paragraphs. And so I think a lot about cadence in that way, you know, which I think is very much a sort of a focus from poetry, is when a writer is sort of asking you to hold your breath, you know, how do you make that happen in English? And when they're asking you to sort of hurry it up, how do you do that? You know, I think the sense of momentum and stamina are certainly things that are really concentrated in poetry, and then I think kind of are easily adapted as ideas to short fiction too.
Yeah, I really like the way this collection was set up with, with the content we had with the stories in Obituary. I think them being very terse and tight made a lot of sense to me. Like they were so heavy, and they already had so much weight to them. Like they didn't need to stretch or spread very much. But then with Invocation, with more themes about love and kind of like these broader, like it made sense to stretch out a little bit more and kind of open your arms. And then with the Spectral Zone being much more experimental, did you get them in just a crazy order and did them separately, or did you get them packaged like when you're doing the translation?
It did change. Initially, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure that the very first version of the book I saw was also in 3 sections, or maybe 4, and it became 3. And then, and there were various changes along the way that were Monica's initiatives about sort of the way that she wanted to distribute things. I can't remember, but I think it was actually Kaija who at the very end suggested that the scene at the end, the section at the end, scenes from the spectral zone, I'm pretty sure that used to be the middle. And invocation was at the end.
I'm almost positive that's true. And
I think so.
I do remember Monica meeting with me in New York around BA last year. Maybe it was BA, I don't remember. And talking about like if there are stories that we wanted to remove or things we wanted to change around. And I remember having a meeting, but I don't remember what it was before and after. But I do remember things like sort of shifted to better fit this 3-part pattern.
Yeah, and I think that was a really smart choice editorially, and I think I remember sort of reacting to things differently at different times. Like I remember at first I was skeptical, to be honest, about having the very last story be instructions for the eye, which used to be towards the middle. But I'm a big fan of that decision now, and I sort of read it a whole bunch of times and came around to it. And I was always adamantly opposed to her taking anything out. No.
Did we take out a story in the end?
Nope. No, we didn't.
Okay. I couldn't remember. I know she kept asking, and I was like, I don't think there's any that need to be taken out, but I couldn't remember if it was something that she's just like, no.
I think she was skeptical. I remember, was really doubtful about The Object, which I love. I'm a huge fan of The Object, which I know you talked about too, which the sort of chronicle of this failed reading of Gordon Lish.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so fantastic. And so I was going to be very upset if that story didn't make it in. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think my note on that story just said The Object, that Gordon Lish is a dick. That was it. Next story. That was the only note I had on that one.
Yeah, he does not come off well. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my God. So funny.
But I also really love, in terms of the changes structurally, that, there's so much of the book that takes place in New York, and she wrote almost the entire book once she was already living in New York. And then I increasingly really love the fact that it ends in Chile, and that there's also just this sense, and this is something talked about in Latin America all the time, is how, in Spanish you can say America, and you're referring to the American continent, you're referring to the American continents, and so the fact of this sort of, this incredibly, both sort of really intricate, intense, up close portrayal of colonialism and racism and xenophobia and sexism occurring in the United States, and then also the sort of the way that the gaze kind of swings totally comprehensively to sort of those very same processes having been enacted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think that there's something, even though the last section is very short, and the Chile stories take up less space in the book, I think there's something really, really beautiful and important about the book ending there.
Yeah. It reminded me when we were organizing it reminded me of, I haven't read these in years, but when I used to read like Joyce Carol Oates story collections, I used to think that they were really intricately like lined up or laid out and like designed in a way where it started out very simply and like sort of walked you through it. And then like the last stories would be like wild and like big, wild, crazy stories. And I thought that was a really cool way to like bring someone through your collection, like a weird, like almost through line based on like the complexity of the prose and like what the ideas are going to be. And I thought that worked kind of with this too, like where you said, Brian, where it's like the terse ones in the beginning spreads out and then it gets into the Chile stories that are more like amorphous.
Yeah. And the sort of idea of narrative itself, I mean, the initial ones are kind of more, there's a sort of a setting and some characters who are talking, and there's a kind of, the arcs are a bit clearer. There's lots of other stuff going on all the time, but in terms of just sort of how a story is told, they're kind of more matter of fact in that way. And then there's a sense of like, all right, here we go.
Yeah. and then wham. Like, I think it's super interesting too, like how these are very political without being like dogmatic. And that's due to her writing, but also to your translating too. That they don't feel overly dogmatic or like prescriptive, but the stories in the whole book feels very like a political statement.
Yeah, I really love and admire that about this book and about Monica as a person also. And I think there's, and I remember she talked last week about how especially a story like Dead Men Don't Rape, being this word that's used in Spanish, like panfletario, which is sort of like propagandist. She was afraid that it would be I don't think she was ever afraid. I don't think she's afraid of anything. But I think that, just wondering whether in certain sort of more staid kind of anxious, U.S. circles, it would be taken as this sort of big incendiary sort of burn it all down. And what I love is that they are in a way, and like they're completely unapologetic about their anger and about our right to our anger and about the need for that anger as a generative force and as sort of the only possible response in many ways to systemic injustice. But I think they do in that sense what all great writing must do, which is that they transform that, they use that sentiment and channel it in a way that it does not remain, like it becomes an experiment in form also, and it sort of challenges itself. The book is constantly challenging itself to find new ways to make things, which is the point of writing, I think, so I really love, I think, and, I was also just sort of laughing in that kind of, oh, do I laugh or cry sort of experience, of, as she said, this is a book that resonates right now in this current moment, but I wrote it a long time in another moment,
Yeah.
And so, and I think also just across the entire book, just over and over again, it seems to me that the statement it makes is that we can be lots and lots of things at the same time. And one of those statements politically is we can be both enraged and in love. We can be both furious and full of a desire for vengeance and a desire for love and for generation. And all of those things are true all at the same time. And so I think, for me, it is a work of sort of true protest to me in that sense, and that it's always sort of looking ahead to what is being made.
So it really does fit for this time super well.
Yeah.
Even though the publication of it was crazy, because I believe the pub date was March 18th, something like that. It was right there. And it was like the pandemic was declared, everything went into shutdown. And this book then came out, and you're just like, and I remember wanting to see if you could make it at some different point in time or change the pub date, but it already shipped to all the stores, and it was like, there's nothing to do. And then now, shit, this book was fucking way timelier than we thought.
Right on time. Yeah.
If we had delayed it, would have been no. This works now.
Yeah.
And people have it's gotten really good response and a lot of good attention, and it seems to be selling fairly well to people too.
I'm so glad, and I hope it has a long. I think the pessimistic part of me, thinking specifically about the timeliness, thinks it won't become less relevant anytime soon. But I also think it will remain like a very beautiful book, and so I hope that it has a long life in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you read her other books as well?
No, I've read a lot of her sort of essays that she's published, and she writes a lot about art and about film. So I've read lots of those, but I haven't read her novels, and I'm really curious. I have read a couple of her recent stories, which are fascinating, and I really, really, really loved them. But the stuff that she published before in book form, I have not.
Yeah, I'm really curious. She explained it a bit, but the twin novels, I'm always very curious as to how that works.
Yeah.
Very cool. Who else are you working on translating right now?
There's this book by Cristina Rivera Garza, which is called The Restless Dead, and she does everything. She's totally all over the place in the best way, and she's been translated a lot. And this is her most academic book in a way. It's about the sort of key subject is this idea of disappropriation, this idea of sort of the collectivity of writing, and sort of what it means to write in a time of sort of political violence and alienation. And she wrote it in Mexico very much for a Mexican audience, and talking a lot about the way that the drug violence have ravaged Mexico, that neoliberalism has ravaged Mexico. But she also turns her attention to a lot of authors in English. And so it's been both a translation and a kind of she has rewritten a lot of it as it's been prepared for the audiences in the States, which has been a really fascinating process. So that's coming out in the fall with Vanderbilt University Press.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, she does so many books. I met her quite a lot years ago, and I think she'd been published by like Curbstone at that point in time, maybe someone else, and then Feminist Press and Dorothy, and yeah, she's great.
She's really great. She's just such an amazing mind. And also just, I think of her like Monica in the sense of there's no self-limitation. There's this sense of just sort of availing yourself of whatever you want, to talk about what you want to talk about, which I really admire. So that, and then there are sort of a bunch of other projects that are in the works, but I don't want to jinx them, so I won't wait till there's a contract to say, but just because poetry lives in a different world, I'm working on a whole bunch of poets, mostly from Mexico and from Argentina, that I'm really excited about. And so it's been also, in the kind of quarantine land, like I haven't really been writing at all myself, but I've been trying to sort of make sure that I'm translating poetry all the time, which feels like a very sustaining relationship.
And sharing a lot of interesting poems on social media too.
That's sort of the only way I'm able to stand them. I think social media is sort of throwing poems that I like out there and seeing if anyone else likes them too.
That's worth it. I'll break the code and it won't be jinx. I promise it won't be jinx. But you're going to be translating a book for us.
I'm very, very, very excited about that.
Yeah, me too. We will have a contract in August when we're allowed to do that again. But until
that was not a veiled comment for you, by the way.
I know it wasn't.
It was like, well, Chad, are we going to say no?
The whole thing's a nightmare because Kaya is furloughed by the university, and she's the only one who can do certain things because of the checks and balances of everything. So when she's gone, it's like we're just stuck. Just have to wait. Cool, but everyone knows. If you translate the Andres Newman book, Bariloche, which is his very first book, correct?
And this is a new correspondence with him, and I'm working on some of his poetry as well, which hasn't been published in English at all. And so that's we've sort of started while we kind of wait for that to get going. In August, I've started in the poems, which has been really fun to do.
That's really cool too. He asked for a copy of your book too, Brian. I forgot to tell you that.
What's that?
He asked for a copy of your book.
Who did?
Andres Newman. From
he doesn't have one?
I don't think so.
Oh, he's gonna be pissed because he gave me the title for it and I didn't use it.
First thing he asked me,
maybe
I end up titling it because we had when Andres is here for things we do. We had a dinner at a tapas restaurant, and it's long. I don't remember what your title was then, but there's a long conversation in which Andres is like, "It should be Walking Dogs. That should be the title of the book." And it's not.
It was, and that's what I presented for them, and they didn't want to go with it. So I said it's good enough for Andres. It's good enough for you guys. Come on, let's go. But that was funny. That was so uncomfortable for me because I had first read him in that Granta Best Spanish Language. It was like 2010 when that came out. The one with Valerie Miles, I think. And he had and I really liked it. And that was the first time I'd really been exposed to much short stories from South America, particularly. So I'd been following him for a while, and then get to meet him and hang out with him and have wine and dinner with him. I was like, I was in awe. He's like, what are you writing? Tell me about what you work on. I was like, oh, I don't want to talk about me. This is uncomfortable. What are the titles of your stories? I started writing. He was like, no, that's not a good one. That's not a good one. That's not a good one. Yes, that's the title. That's the title of the book. Do that and it'll get published. So it's like, all right, thanks, Andre. So weird. It's so weird.
Yeah, it is always kind of strange having like people come here too to Rochester.
If it gets translated to Spanish, I think it should be called Walking Dogs in Spanish. That sounds fantastic to me. So
yeah,
all right.
We'll do that in honor of Mr. Newman.
Yeah.
How do you find the projects that you want to work on or that you try and pitch? Is it mostly through a lot of reading? I know that you were in Guadalajara meeting with people too, but like, I'm just curious what your process is for finding stuff, because it's such a wide world and you're there in Mexico City. You're not, here getting like the news from afar.
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as writers in Mexico, it really has been just by virtue of being here, and it's a huge city, small world, I'd say, Mexico City, and so just through friends and friends of friends. I mean, I think still I know more poets than prose writers, and I think also just I've had this really beautiful collaboration with this press called Antílope, which is what's published my poetry here. But I really love what they've published of young Mexican poets too, and so I've been not kind of on purpose, but like I will translate the catalog of Antílope, but I really like what they publish in general, and so. And two of the poets I'm working on now, both young Mexican poets named Isabel Zapata and Marisela Guerrero, they've both been published by that press as well. And so it's a pretty close process, in that we've known each other for a long time now. So that as far as poetry, it feels close to home in that sense. I've also just had what's turned into a really generative collaboration and friendship with a poet from Argentina who was actually my first translation teacher, named Ezequiel Seidenberg, and we've translated each other mutually. And he lives in New York now and has for many years, but he still works with a lot of poets in Argentina. And so I haven't spent much time in Argentina beyond that one semester I was there, but I've stayed in touch with a lot of Argentine poets. And so it feels, I think this probably happens in general, but I think especially with poetry, just because it is sort of such an underdog world, and just sort of, and there's this kind of fervor and so many things are kind of interlaced with friendship, I think. That's how a lot of things have happened for me in that sense. With prose, it's been much more varied, and some of it is also what I read and what I end up liking. I've also done some, translation, been sort of hired to translate samples for a couple of agencies. And so sometimes there was a book that came out almost exactly at the same time as Monica's book, as Cars on Fire, called Animals at the End of the World by a Colombian writer named Gloria Susana Esquivel. And I didn't know her before, and I hadn't read her work, and that was through a gig translating the sample, which I loved. And so that was a sort of lucky connection in that sense. But yeah, it's still sort of more hit or miss and less sort of streamlined, I'd say, with prose projects. And yet there's a lot of luck in it too. I mean, just sort of like what happened with Andres was like, you put us in touch and we started emailing, and then this sort of all started coming together.
Yeah, he said, well, yeah, I think I told you, but what he said, I'll embarrass you, is that he said your translations of poetry, and so he wanted to talk to you to see if you'd translate his poem.
Oh, that's lovely.
He's like, I know you know her, and I just want her to translate my poems because I like what she does with her.
That's so nice.
Yeah.
He's a really generous guy. Yeah.
He really is. He's great. Very great. What is the scene like right now for poetry, like Spanish language, Latin American, Mexican poetry? Are there some current common themes or approaches that are popular right now, or is it like all over the place?
Brian, you're being adorned. I see.
We have all kinds of kid interruptions today.
I love it. I'm going to see if I can get a cat interruption, but he's retreated. But I mean, I think just hugely, hugely diverse. And I also think that just because in a way of just the same two sort of life situations that I've mentioned, I mean, the only two places where I feel like I'm reading with any real breadth in terms of what's being published in poetry are in Mexico and to some extent in Argentina. But I'm just constantly amazed in Mexico just by the output and the variety and the kind of vibrancy. I mean, I think especially also I'm always really fascinated by the differences sort of in how writing is supported in different societies, you know, and in the US, there's such an intense link to the academy and to writing programs and to magazines associated with universities. And in Mexico, for a long time, it's been kind of the opposite. And there's been sort of there's no real link historically to academia, but there has been for the last number of decades a lot of government sponsored grants. And so it's sort of I think, you know, kind of, which is, you know, similarly to MFAs, both an advantage and a disadvantage. And it means that there is state support for the arts, which is being cut at an astonishing speed. But, you know, there has been, and lots of young poets and writers and artists in general, you know, have sort of had as this kind of this, to get one of these grants that will support you to make art for a year or a number of years is pretty incredible. And I wish more countries had that. At the same time, it means that there's a huge amount of competition for those grants. And it means, surprise, surprise, that it's very centralized. You know, in a city like Mexico City, where so many resources and institutions are focused, it means that it's much, much harder for young poets who are living in other states, other parts of the country, to access those sorts of opportunities. So it's, you know, the setup is really different, but I think it makes for both challenges and support systems that have, I think, in the last, you know, 10, 20 years, just also allowed a sort of a whole generation of really, really diverse poets to come into their own.
Yeah. I think I always think of Mexican poetry through the lens of the Savage Detectives, in terms of like, the fervor and the standing for poetry and like the importance of like the different associations and all that. I just always think of it through that particular.
Yeah. Which I think is, you know, it's a source of like, there's still very much the sense both of a kind of the Savage Detectives and the kind of cafe culture and all of that. But then also these towering figures who, you know, are both undeniably a part of things and also sort of are a source of real frustration. I mean, just sort of like Octavio Paz. And I think for me, one of the most interesting and inspiring things about being here in the last couple of years have been seeing just the sort of the intensity and pride and diversity of feminist movements in the Mexican writing worlds also, and just historically this ridiculous underrepresentation of women in the arts, in the academy too. But in terms of what's being published and by who. And I think for me, the most exciting, almost without exception, writing that's being done in Mexico today is by women. And so to have that sort of kind of rise up as not just a voice, but as many, many, many voices, claiming a place for themselves that's been denied for a long time is long overdue, of course, and really awesome.
It's really cool. So I have a question. This is the toughest question yet. Which is your favorite story in Cars on Fire?
That is hard. I love the extermination. I have a very just a real soft spot for extermination, and I love Animal Mosaic also.
Oh, interesting.
And Cars on Fire, actually. I think it's just such an amazing. It's just so full of so many things, and I think also just as like the first story I read, I was like, wow.
Yeah, I've been sort of avoiding the extermination part because my favorite line, we always end with like the favorite line from this reading, is from there, and it's perfect. But I'm going to skip past it because this line also is amazing and seems to resonate right now. And since the extermination started eating other people, the ones who talked, the ones I told them were saying mean things about me and him, they got even more scared. Hello, police. Hello, City Hall. Hello. This is great.
I think Monica is also like a really gifted comic writer. Like she's hilarious.
Very funny. I like this. I underlined this too. I left with him because he's my best friend and he eats people to defend me, and nobody else ever bothered me or hit me or said anything mean to me again. I love it. Love it.
I love it too.
So fun. Yeah, they're all really good stories. And you did a brilliant job translating this. It's really
thank you.
Very, very smooth.
It was such an honor to translate it, and it was also just such a wonderful thing to have it be published by you guys. This was just such a dream across the board.
So it's very cool. It's very cool. And I like that we do her and Carlos and you and Phil translate them, which is fun too.
Yeah.
So it's all
it
nice.
was so nice to meet Will in Guadalajara also.
Yeah, that was a fun.
That's really funny.
That was a whole thing.
Yeah, also 100 million years ago.
Oh my God, that was like in November?
It was in, like November, early December.
Holy shit, that's so
Crazy.
long ago.
Yeah.
So beautiful and like such a fun time. I still loved everything about that. We had that huge party for like everyone who's involved with Open Letter, and like the bill was like $80. Like, cool. We can totally afford this. This is where we should have all our parties. But oh man, Brian, do you have other questions that you wanted to ask or comments? Nope.
Who is that addressed to?
To you.
Oh, had a funny, well, not funny, amusing anecdote with this collection. I remember I was giving. It was the day after your wedding, and we had a brunch at your house. And Carlos and Monica made the trip from New York to Rochester to attend, and they were going to walk to the train station. And I was like, I'll give you guys a ride. And so they hopped in the back of my car, and I was driving them to the station. I was just kind of like chatting with them, like, "Oh, Carlos, I've read some of your stuff before. Like, it was really cool." And I was like, "Monica, what do you do?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm also a writer." I'm like, "Oh, cool. What kind of stuff do you write?" She's like, "Yeah, like, I don't know, like weird, crazy stories." And I was like, "Man, that sounds amazing. I'd love to read those sometimes." Like, they're only in Spanish, she said. And so then all these years later, here comes this book that just comes out, and we're doing a podcast on it, and the wonderful Robin has translated it, and it's these cool, crazy stories she's telling about in this car ride. But I thought, there's no way I'll ever get to read this work. And it's just like, it's crazy and amazing the way the world works, that here this thing is plopped on my desk, and I get to experience it. And I feel so lucky to have gotten to read it. And thank you so much for all the work you put into it.
Oh, thank you. What a cool story.
And I was, I loved everyone. So you both did a fantastic job with it. So
thank you so much.
Well done all around. That's all I got. Good feelings for everybody in these
Yay.
times of crazy.
Do you have a favorite line from the last few stories, Brian?
Chad, how could I pick? Child, please.
Robin, do you have a favorite line?
Nice try.
You can have the finished copy of that.
I do.
Oh, you do?
No, because I have like this weird front and back photocopies of it, and so that the one that is supposed to be in columns is just paragraphs for me. So I had a completely different reading experience.
One day, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
You get the full column experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot that. So you did get your copies, like, because there's so many people who didn't. Like, we're just locked out of our office. I feel like, and no mail is coming there. So
I did. It was really lucky. Also, the timing I got. I had the mail is very tricky here, but I had a friend who was coming to visit in January. So I had some. Like, I think my parents have a bunch of them in their house in Vermont, and my friend brought me a couple. So that was really good. Yeah.
Well, very cool. Very cool. So do you have a favorite line?
I have so many favorite lines, but I was thinking of the very last bit of The Root, which I just think is really beautiful. It goes, "Then the storm hit and made the land grow wild with roots. Wherever the men in white aprons happened to be, they would see lanugo burgeoning between the concrete and the industrial mushrooms, and they would hear the secret name spoken loud and clear, the name that hails from all our fragrant winds, our own damp earth."
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Here's my favorite. "Then things got weird."
I was about to pick that one. That's funny. That's funny.
And things got weird.
That's extermination, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
They did indeed. Yeah.
I hit that when I was reading and just circled. It was like, fucking yes. Like that is very fitting. Do you have anything, Brian, or you want?
Yep.
No. So Robin, where can people find you online, and like what books of yours should they go buy?
Well, I would love. Sorry, this sounds getting a little weird. I would love to fly the flag for Gloria's book, Animals at the End of the World, which is out from University of Texas Press, and you can get that on their website or on Bookshop or wherever. What else? There's also a book that's very near to my heart is Lyric Poetry is Dead by this Argentine poet, my dear friend Ezequiel Seidenberg, which is out from Cardboard House Press. That was a couple years ago. And then, both poems and translations of mine on the interwebs in various places. My own books have not been published in the United States, but they have been in bilingual editions in Mexico and elsewhere. And the Mexican editions are available. I hate Amazon, as I know we all do, but they are on, I think, only on Amazon. And in a couple of bookstores in New York, but I'm not sure if they're still available or can be ordered online from those bookstores. But there's one called Amalgama, which is, and these are both by Ediciones Antílope in Mexico, and the other more recent book is called Having, which was translated into Spanish as Tener. And yeah, those are, and there are selections on the internet. But yes, that is also has been a strange, totally nonlinear experience of having poetry published in Mexico, but not in the States.
That is. I'm going to make a guess that if there's a way to get those books, Brazos probably has them too.
I think Brazos, I know, has books I've translated also by a Mexican press called Argonautica, which publishes bilingual editions. So it's possible, that's a good thought, that Brazos would have books by Antílope as well. I'm such a big fan of theirs and of Mark Haber's. Yeah.
Mark is fantastic. That's what I thought. He's got the good connection there. So he goes to Mexico City regularly. So I'll bet if there's a way to do it, he's got them. So if you don't want to order through Amazon, I'd try and hit them up first. But
yes, yep. And I know again that he does have books by this other press that is just really wonderful called Argonautica.
They're super cool.
Yeah, they're doing good stuff.
Not that long ago, and had a visit here.
Oh, that's right. You saw. I remember you telling me that. Yep. Yeah, and he's a really wonderful writer himself, Efren. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Didn't you do a sample of his book?
I did, yep. Mm-hmm. It's this great novel called, sort of dystopian novel called Smoke. And we're still looking for a home for it. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that this one might be on me. I think I have that, but I haven't read it yet because I think we talked about it in like February and then everything stopped.
And then the world exploded.
I don't remember what I have and haven't looked at. I have no idea. It's just.
I'd be happy to resend it to you if that would be helpful. Not to sort of.
I have no idea what's going on.
Was that the one you were saying? There's no way in hell you're gonna do that one. I remember you telling me something.
Yeah, that was exactly.
Over my dead body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to plug, Brian?
I want to plug the Bible because the world's going to end pretty soon. So y'all better pray to your gods and get
really
ready.
Needs plugging the Bible. Yeah.
Yeah. We need. No, I have absolutely nothing to plug other than read more translated literature. If you're listening to this, I'm sure that's not a problem. But there's lots of stuff outside the United States that you should be reading. Go read that and support it in any way you can. So please do that.
And in 2 weeks, you'll be an Atlantean.
Yes, cannot wait.
2 weeks.
So that's so crazy. So now that we finished Cars on Fire, the next book that we're doing is 4x4 by Sara Mesa, which came out in May. And we'll be starting this next week with the first section. It'll be 4 weeks, and the first section is called Part 1, No More Than 200. It goes up from page 1 to 86, so it's a bit longer. And then there's 2 short sections, and then a very short final episode. But that's the next one. Then we'll move on to the Book of Anna by Carmen Buyosa. So all Spanish writers, Spanish female writers. Oh, yeah. I've been signaled also with 4x4. There is an audiobook that was released yesterday. So our first professional audiobook, Tantor Media produced it. Had very professional readers that did it. It is available for sale through Audible, through Libro FM, through anywhere that you can get audiobooks. I think it'll probably even be in like Overdrive through libraries. So if you'd rather listen to 4x4 instead of read it, you can also get that copy there. And we have, if you go to our Twitter, Open Letters
That's
Twitter,
so exciting.
10-minute sample of it too that you can hear, which is pretty cool. But okay, well, I think that's everything before Alex destroys this whole recording. So thank you again, Robin, for coming on. Oh, it might have froze.
Oh dear. The internet is going crazy.